which kind of triggered what you were talking about. She was like, "Oh, I didn't raise you to be not dangerous. You're definitely dangerous."
Yeah.
And she's like, "I made you that way. There's a purpose for every violence." And I was like,
Oh,
"Mommy," she was like, "violence can be purposeful and not abusive."
that's
And
absolutely right.
I was like, "Let me get my next poetry collection together."
Collecting.
Collecting.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful for my mother for preparing me to fight.
I love Mockingbird.
Thanks.
I love it. It reminds me of my Aunt Tina, my great Aunt Tina.
Mm,
The poems about your mom made me think about my great Aunt Tina really a lot, like a lot.
like I rarely read that one. I read it. I'm pretty sure I read it at the last CC we were at together, and then I read it the other day at this poetry event that I organized with Jose Oliveris and Christine or Cynthia Manick at Adelphi, where I teach now. So maybe I'll read it today because I like my mama.
Yeah. I have like a set of poems. How do I say? It's like, because sometimes I'll have a special, oh, we're live. Sorry, as usual, we're in the middle of conversating. Good evening, Augustonians. Welcome back to Lit Friday. If this is your first time joining us, we hope to see you again and again. My name is Jessica Lene, and I am the host and literary curator for Lit Friday, which takes place on the final Friday of each month. We feature readings and conversations with incredible writers, thinkers, and artists from the African diaspora. Before I introduce our incredible guest, Maya Marshall, let's check our calendars for May. On May 6th, we have the Take Center Stage Higher Ground Gala and the Encore After Party. On May 13th, we have the Youth Writers Camp. And on May 20th, we have Hip Hop Camp. Our next Lit Friday on May 26th, we are honored to welcome Antonio Howard, a brilliant activist, muralist, and writer from Erie, Indiana. I will also brag and say that we used to work together at the Federal Public Defender's Office of Western Pennsylvania, and he was wonderful as then as well as now. We're going to be discussing his self-published autobiography, When a Child is Worth More Than the Worst Mistake He Ever Made. So come visit us and sign on with us and get all the details at awaacc.org. Tonight we have Maya, the lion, my lion, Marshall, with us to discuss her debut poetry collection, All the Blood Involved in Love. This collection gives grace to brutal honesty and beauty to startling clarity, covering subjects from desire to abortion to misogynoir to abiding love to the genius of everyday survival to passion to sex to memory. The poetry in All the Blood Involved in Love will tattoo itself on your skin. It'll make you dare to think all of the daring thoughts and get you writing if you're in a writer's block. I wrote a poem after I read it the first few times. Maya Marshall is the author of the poetry collection, All the Blood Involved in Love, and this chapbook, Secondhand. She is the co-founder of Underbelly, the journal on the practical magic of poetic revision. Marshall was the 2021 to 2023 Poetry Fellow at Emory University, following her time as artist in residence at Northwestern University. She holds fellowships from MacDowell, Canem, Vermont Studio Center, Callaloo, The Watering Hole, and Community of Writers. Her poetry, essays, reviews, and interviews have been published in or are forthcoming in Boston Review, Crazyhorse, Best New Poets, Poets and Writers, the Southampton Review, and elsewhere. She works as an editor for Haymarket Books. She is an assistant professor of English and creative writing at Adelphi University. Welcome, friend. I am so happy to be with you and spend time with you.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so pleased to be with you. I'm pretty sure that I'm supposed to read some poems now.
Yes, we would love to hear 5 to 7 minutes of your beautiful work. And if you want to read more, feel free, feel welcome. I can't wait to hear you read.
Thank you.
I'm going to go away so you all can focus on Maya.
I'm going to follow the rules and read 5 to 7 minutes of poems. I think all of them will come from this book, All the Blood Involved in Love. The question around which this book orbits is, why don't you parent a little? Why don't you parent a little? The story is that there is so much loss, so much waste in a woman who does not make a body with her body, such sunk potential in a sex that does not produce. The story is that we have progressed. The story is that the Black woman is safe. The story is that the Black woman is safe if she protects her king. The king is dead. Speaking of everyday survival, I take myself for walks. I wake up alone every morning. I go to sleep alone every night. I count sleeping pills. I count every pill I can find and conjure a friend who hanged himself. I'm years older than he was when he died. I don't want to kill myself. I wake up alone and take myself for walks. I listen to podcasts and cry at well-told stories. I take myself for walks hoping to help. I take myself for walks and talk to God. I talk to him when I'm alone, alone like when I'm walking down a hospital corridor. I talk to him when I come to a crossroads. I talk to him because I know my secrets will be safe. He doesn't talk back. He doesn't have to exist. What good is a God you can't trust? I can make his lack of intervention a scapegoat, and I can make my boons his glory. We're all just telling stories. I don't mean to say that stories aren't powerful, they are. And so I'll include a couple of poems about people speaking up or picking up stories. For Don Wooten, I have the good fortune to be free, to choose, to have a part of my cervix intact, to change the locks after I'm attacked. Somebody offered me a karate class. I could still, with a little more of the luck I've already enjoyed, say yes to a man, to a little sugar. Nobody has a life without a woman's blood. I could still go under and come out whole enough to make another whole life. A child to place to my mother's bosom, oh, to be free enough to pick apart a rapist man in charge. Or a god doctor with some script for all the reasons he knows life is his enough to give or take. Like a wave, to drown, uncover, or cover up. All right, I'm going to read one more. I'm going to read it because it gets a little weird at the end, and I'm into it. The field of blood. In the hospital, the man I love lowers his eyes. Catheter, cotton. I join his mother for a walk. If I were your mother, I'd tell you not to marry him. My own mother says I can't stay with a sick man. You want to fix everything. But why should we leave good things broken? On some night, my love says, I wouldn't want to be black. I try to understand how he could call blackness the burden, not the whiteness heaped on top of it. Blackness is not a failure of the body. I bleed daily for a month, produce a liver-shaped thing. He rinses his blood with a chemical cocktail every third Thursday. We make nothing. No child, no pacts, but distance until we both lose. On some day in our home, my love says our child would not be black, but we're American, I think, and say she would. He thinks we understand each other because of his illness and my blackness, but my blackness does not make me sick. Love has betrayed my heart. I'm sure Judas loved Jesus, but fear is a tyrant. And this story, you're Judas, and I'm Judas too. A cynic would say he just loved money more, but what would they say to the field of blood? I loved my man and our cats, but the girl in my chest will always chase the storm in the field, abandon the ghost in the house, leave the blood and water running in the bathtub and hair on the floor, walk into the warm spring night in a blackout, follow the moon down the sidewalk, eyes glinting like the backyard cougars of my youth, and leave you with your bare heart and your mended bones, waiting for me to come back. A version of me will leave and let the felines starve, because the beast in me does not want to be needed. A cat's cry mimics an infant's cry. I like to think I could deny even this.
It's funny that you ended with that poem because, of course, like any writer, I think, maybe mark like my books for the things that I want to remember, and the marking helps. And remember, I was like, I'm going to get some of this tattooed on me. That's the line. I'm like, maybe it will end up on my forearm. Maybe I mean, like, eventually, just as a reminder. There's a there's like a trespass happening here. I just remember people always referring to the speaker and poetry collections instead of addressing the author as you.
Yeah,
And at first, I regarded this as like a respectful distance, right? Without the you, then you're not really asking if the work is autobiographical. But in All the Blood Involved in Love, you just walk right over that. There's some gestures where you walk right over that with a fearlessness. And I wanted you to talk more about negotiating that speaker and you.
oh, sure. Well, I will say that I know which parts are true and which parts are only true enough to honor the poem, um, because they are made objects, these artifacts, and because there's no circumstance where any person can fully render themselves on a page, and because I haven't written an autobiography, right, or a memoir. Um, Poetry allows some necessary space, uh, but the details are, the real details are sometimes necessary too. And the only little bit of membrane I have to protect me is that I know which ones are which. You know,
Mhm. And how do you negotiate, for instance, at an event or when you're in a class and someone is regarding one of your works, that passage from from them addressing it as an object into like a reaching? I think sometimes people think of poets as like shamans of some sort, or they regard them as people with a calling, or even sometimes mistake poets for therapists. And so they attempt to like reach. And
mm,
I know a lot of poets feel this reaching sometimes, especially in extremely public situations. And they're like, how do you regard those moments when you experience them as a writer and a poet?
sure. That's a fascinating question. I think if someone is reaching, then there's something that they're absent of that they need. And um, sometimes they're reaching because they want to take more from the poet, take more from the person that made the poem. But I've given plenty, and so I just return to the poem more often than not. Um, it would be nice if we were in a circumstance where everyone made an effort to protect one another all the time, but that's not where we live. So, yeah, I usually go back to talking about craft because that's what's at stake here. Mostly, that's the thing I'm asking for attention to, in the practice of publishing work publicly. Um, and the living part, that's just what made me able to craft these poems about issues that are beyond me. Uh, it's a question I'm thinking even more about now as I write my second book, giving myself more distance, giving myself the um, costumes that I could use to explore from other vantage points through persona, through um, landscape, uh, landscaping, I guess. What are they called? Like, yeah, they're basically landscape portraits, right? Right, when you write about a space in order to affect an emotional state or an imagistic rendering that allows for some greater understanding or investigation. That's what I mean. Those are the types of poems I'm trying to make now. And to some extent, they begin here, in front of a lake or at a bird sanctuary or on a sidewalk in the night. Um, and so maybe the next most useful craft work is for me to be very intentional about keeping the camera on the scene in front of the speaker rather than on the interior life of the speaker, which is where most of these live. That kind of intimate setting, whether you want it to or not, invites people to ask for more intimacy.
There's something, it's interesting you use the word publishing publicly, because before the camera started, before the session started, we were briefly discussing, you said this book is for Black women. It's from a very particular perspective. And
Mhm.
sometimes I think that when people regard Black women poets, like I said, they do regard them as like this therapist. They come with the expectation that they'll be given more. And in that way, they sometimes ignore the craft and focus on trying to draw more from the most difficult emotional parts of the work,
Yeah.
as if there's this like thirst that needs to be slaked for watching us suffer.
I don't know what it is, but people are really have a hard time looking away or not poking a wound. um, and maybe it's this, sometimes it is certainly a sense that they deserve more of us, more of our experience so that we can reveal some deeper understanding, the sort of magical Negro ideology that dominated, I don't know, centuries of our lives. Um, and sometimes it is this like comfort woman uh, transference deal, and sometimes it's just that we want to know that our suffering is matched, mirrored somewhere else in the world, because there's hope then that someone can teach us how to get out of it. And why wouldn't we have that desire, you know? And so that's where this book is located a little bit, right? It is about the blood. It is about the wound. It is also about the love and the tenderness and the closeness and the sex of it and the friendship of it and the loss. And so in that way, yeah, it is most received, most seen and understood by Black women, but it exists beyond us as a useful set of emotional guides and sound sculptures, which is what poems are, as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what are doing with it, besides maybe getting lines tattooed on them and maybe, maybe seeing themselves reflected and maybe believing that they understand something about the Black women in here that they didn't know before. But hopefully, the grounding line, the sort of center, sort of steel string going through it, is always uh, craft. It's always the images and the sound.
What are the craft tools that you find help you construct a respectful aesthetic distance? Have you found any recently that are new to you that you're enjoying using?
A respectful aesthetic distance. What is that? What is that? Um,
A very gently sparking fence.
I like that. I'm gonna stick with the landscapes. I think traditional forms, signal a formal signal of formalism, signal that this is a structure erected, that you are entering into a world that has its own rules to be acknowledged and attended to. Um, and so pulling back toward formalism, toward blank verse, toward those structures that often make people feel locked out of homes. Ask,
Ari, could you mute, please? Sorry.
ask readers to avert their focus to the structure and see how it informs the content, instead of focusing on the content and then demanding more of it, which is what our culture asks us to do, right? Right now, that's why the infinite scroll is an option, why it's the preferred state in the digital realm. Yeah. Also, having a form in which to move, a building in which to explore, helps me organize my thoughts and inquiries so that I don't feel overwhelmed by the terrain of them, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, those are the tools at the moment.
So you mentioned like a steel wire,
Mm.
and there's so much included here, and the word choices, the diction in the book are so careful and specific. Like you said, craft is the key, craft is the game in your work. So when you were approaching the book and thinking about its form, its architecture, and how you're going to move your way through it, what was the connecting thread through all of the stories that you told for you? You said one question was, why don't you do a little parenting? Was there anything else aside from that question, or an answer that you had in mind to that question that helped you kind of
Book.
connect everything that you touch very tenderly at that?
I mean, I'm pretty tender in general. That's how I touch things. I will say I didn't actually understand that the central question of this sheaf of poems is, do I want to be a parent? And what would it mean? But it is, and the ways that it's investigated are, what would it mean to have a Black child in this moment? What would it mean to be a queer parent in this life where I'm both monogamous and bisexual? And that informs every investigation in these pages. What would it mean to, what things do parents inherit from their parents that they then necessarily pass down? Um, how are children treated in our nation? What are the facts? Like, what are the stats about adoption? So, like, Black children are $12,000 less expensive to adopt than white children, um, and adopted at a much slower rate. Uh,
What's the line? The Black boy is a steal or a bargain, 17K.
It's a steal, only $17,000. That, like, a stillbirth is still actually a $20,000 bill. Um, you, you have to go use healthcare in this system, and it is expensive. Yeah. And then at the end, you get trauma and no baby and debt, maybe. And the chances of that are much higher if you're a Black woman, but you might also then die, uh, or have your requests ignored, because that's how systemic racism works in our nation. And so there are those questions, but there's also questions of what does it mean to be a woman without being a mother? And here it means, pure friendships where partners die or people just spend time looking at the birds, that there's a life to be lived with just attention to what is here every day already. Um, and so I didn't have to do a whole lot of arranging, um, but there are arcs in these poems. Like I'm saying that these poems came to be because these were the investigations happening over the 10 years that it took to write them.
Mhm.
And then I did not want some sort of chronological, the speaker is young, the speaker is aged arc, but like because there's such heaviness, and the more overtly political tied to Newsline's poems, I wanted this back third, that sort of denouement space to be fairly hopeful, to turn toward the big water, which is where it ends, and this decision to be invested in loving oneself so that one can be part of the larger sea and not just sort of the one stream. Um, and it starts with the central question because I'm a pragmatist. And if someone picks up a book, they should know what it is that they're getting into. Um, so that's a little bit of the architecture. It's three movements because I'm a Western storyteller and that's what we do. Um, most of the time, most effectively, and it's easy enough to read without being demanding of our attention, that there's a rising conflict into our current political state, and then its resolution into um, the speaker wanting healthfulness and connection in the end.
Big Water is one of those poems that I just circled the whole thing. And it left me with the question or the thought that perhaps people are misunderstanding the function of hope.
Say more about that.
So I think that people use hope as a waiting room. I'm going to keep hoping and I'm going to keep waiting. And this is something that you mentioned, I think in the poem Mockingbird about your mom. She waited,
Mm.
right? You said there's like she waited. Um,
So maybe I can read each of these poems, Mockingbird and um, The Big Water, and we can talk a little bit about hope, which is one of those words that is
Absolutely.
a verb. It's an action like loving.
Absolutely.
It's a discipline. If you listen to Miriam Kaba, who is correct about hope being a discipline. And I'll tell you one thing that's activated me my entire life, because I grew up on Mr. Rogers, is that he would say, if something traumatic is happening in the world, something terrible is happening, you go and you look for the helpers. And if you don't see them, you become one, you be a helper, right? That's hopefulness. That's the thing that allows for us to maintain a balance between the things that assault us and the things that we um, build beautifully or that are here to be maintained.
The poem's actually Eviction.
Ah,
Has been waiting for God to pay.
got it. So yeah, I have there's a whole lot about God and faith in this book, um from this agnostic speaker who yeah, I think that a reality of African American life is that the church is almost always at the center of it.
Mhm.
And, I'm Christian as much as I was raised one, so there's no removing the foundation for me. Those stories, the biblical stories, the structures of the church are the undergirding for the way that I see the world, even if I intellectually don't believe it. I think, like it says in this poem, God doesn't have to exist in order to exist, right?
Mhm.
Um, and we do just have to get on with the business of living. I think there's a foil here between the mother and the daughter in this book. Um, and one is deeply faithful, and the other is really only able to have faith in time. So, and time and intervention and trying and making the effort to connect.
Hope,
So, go ahead.
hope, the action.
Hope, the action. So yeah, so eviction goes like this. It says, her her sisters carry her things to the stoop. 6 dachshunds herd the fur she hasn't cleaned, chase diabetic feet up, down the winding wrought iron staircase. Tomorrow, she will miss all of her rooms. True, no room or man was ever hers at all. She has been waiting for God to pay. She has been winding yarn in the absence of filters, ash. Each year, leaving home brings her closer to its every chamber, each block and sibling. She has been waiting for all these years. Untethered, she will not look to her mother, the wrinkles of her, the sag she made when she filled her, the stretch marks that surround the exit wound, nor wonder that we return by necessity. We return by necessity.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think we have to be persistent and engaged to get what we hope for.
Absolutely. And I think that when I got to Big Water, I thought of that question about hope because, as I said, you mentioned hope as an action. If you can't find the helpers, you become the helper, and that's hope, right? Hope that throwing in a little bit of your diligence and your duty and your effort will ease or transform or at least change things. If ease is not the goal, then a change. But a
Mhm.
lot of people will use hope as like a waiting room and they become inactive and they sit. But there's so much pragmatism in the Big Water, and you already used that word to describe yourself
Mhm.
um, as an individual. And so the Big Water captures me as a reader because there's so much acceptance. And a part of pragmatism is acceptance. And it
Yeah,
feels like you can't actually take action and hope unless you're able to accept certain things about the world that are the law. And
yeah.
one of the laws is that you have to learn how to love yourself. Things remain difficult the longer that you don't.
And they remain difficult when you do, but you can proceed to do something additional once you do. Otherwise, you are stagnant, trapped, self-destructing, and that makes you useless, really. We're not going to make it if we're not working collectively, and collectively only works if we can take care of ourselves individually and then take care of one another. Because also, it's true, you can't pour from an empty vessel. Um, that's yeah, that's the hopefulness. That's what the Big Water is. It is a an awareness that collective action can and does and has worked, and that it can only continue if those individuals in the collective are in good repair, you know. Um, yeah, I like this poem. I like that it is a both and. I like that that the form is invested in being both and. So it's a duplex after Jericho Brown's form that's named after the type of housing structure, right, where it is individual and this larger thing, but it has a push-pull, which is the world we live in. It is good and bad pulling at each other. It is opposites creating a sort of homeostasis. Um, and that's well, I think what I see is the relationship between the individual and the collective. It's in this time when we have to fight, you know, pendulums swing. This one is swinging right now in our nation towards pretty extreme conservatism. Um, and it will swing back toward a pretty radical liberalism. I hope that will land somewhere close to the left, maybe not the liberal, certainly not the liberal extreme. But whatever it is, it's only going to happen if we work at it as a group, which is pretty hard to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm gonna switch gears a little bit because I want you to talk about the cover.
sure.
I want to hear about the cover design. I've
Great
read
cover.
I've read who the photographer is, another you know, acute and astute and wonderful poet, right?
Is she?
Rachel Eliza Griffiths. But I wanted to know what spoke to you about the image
Sure.
and why it was for this book.
Oh, I'm so excited this is the cover for this book. It's so beautiful and unsettling, you know, which I think is also true of the book. But I wanted something that feels gentle and tender and unnerving and strange. That is celebratory of the Black feminine, and that mars a little bit about the, the purity of the Black feminine um, by having this mask on it, this blondness. But I went about finding a photo from Rachel Eliza Griffiths because I want to be in that club. I want to be, you know, one of the Black poets who has one of Eliza's photos on the cover of her book. Um, and so I just reached out and asked nicely. She was like, of course, because she's so generous and brilliant and like sharp. She is deeply curious. She is an artist in all of the ways, and she'll be corrective, but you won't. Like, you ever watch her in interviews? She corrects people without them noticing, you
Mhm.
know, and then suddenly they've picked up on the language she's used to reorient to them. It's impressive. So yeah, I wanted this darkness balanced a little bit with the light because that is, you know, that's the sentiment that's at the center of this collection.
Mhm. Balance. I'm also thinking about the way that you write the personalities, the subjects in the book are throughout the poem. They're poems, but there's something very novelesque about the building of character, about the building of the personalities that are in the book. And it
Mm.
made me want to ask the question, what outside of poetry motivates you or gets you writing or gets your engine running or gets you thinking? That's another art form.
Cool. I like that question. Um, I love museums and photography. I am a bad photographer who likes to take classes and walk around looking at things. I enjoy that. I am, yeah, it's kind of a question of inspiration, right? So, would I listen to music, go to concerts, or just listen to jazz albums? I listen to like early days Stevie Wonder. The experimentation is the thing I hear in the music, the feeling, right? So this book is born out of a site of deep emotion in this person um, over many, many years. And music is maybe the most immediate conduit for that type of access to deep emotion, to those currents.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, music does that, gets me wanting to write things down. Um, and you're saying outside of poetry, though, I'll tell you, going to a good poetry reading makes me want to go write a poem. It makes me very happy that you read this book. I found yours. I want to read the poem you wrote. I'm so excited about that. Um, yeah, but I also love going to the movies. And I'm into, when I go to the museums, I like to go and look at portraits of different eras. So, you know, like Impressionism is cool to me because it is all about making the gestalt out of some tiny, tiny details. Um, and I think because what I think you're picking up on is like the portraiture that's in this book. I make portraits of people um, by often accumulating a lot of objects that they might uh, touch or use or that are populate their spaces. Um, and so, yeah, giant paintings do that for me. Like Dali paintings do that for me. But so then do quilts. So
Mm.
there's, yeah, a Southern girl in me who grew up going to museums in Georgia and Houston and South Carolina and looking at the handicrafts of Black people, Black women, of the Gullah folks, and seeing these narrative productions, these quilts. But also, I grew up in the household of an artist who curated for a children's museum and brought storytellers to the house. And so, storytellers are 100% an influence for how I make poems and make me want to make more poems. So I would not say, I think that it would take me a lot of years to make a successful novel. Successful being like had a clear story, beginning, middle, and end. Because I'm still pretty lyric comparatively.
Mm. It's wonderful to hear you mention impressionism, because when I was thinking about the portraiture that you're mentioning, I was definitely thinking about the specificity is very like post-impressionist. It made me think of the German expressionism, the non-mimetic or non-local color that's used to give an image to someone, like Toulouse-Lautrec making a painting of a woman with a green face. And
Hmm.
she will always be herself because he gave her a green face. And I was thinking about that bright kind of quality of specificity that you find in portraiture that ends up abandoning, right, realism, in part because of the advent of photography, right? It was Whistler that was like, said, if you want an accurate image, go find a photographer. That's not my job anymore. And then also thinking about them in concert with Eliza Griffith's photography, right?
Mhm,
And having this itself be very surreal and kind of
mhm.
cusping on the Dada in terms of how it's constructed, right? Like seeing the influences come together
Yeah.
in this way.
It felt like a gift. Also, the image is called the Black Unicorn after our beloved Audre Lorde. Her collection, which was, I think that's probably the collection I've read the most in my life. It is, yeah. It felt like every single element of this book came to fit neatly together, without my knowing all the names for all the things and asking them to come into a place. They just came into the place. So it is refreshing to hear you, artist, human artist, person with a background in art history, um, draw out the connections that I was able to name just from being an observer in art spaces. And it is satisfying to me that you see them coming together here. Yeah.
Absolutely. I have a special request. And when you were reading earlier, I wanted to hear the poems, but I also was hoping that I would have the opportunity to make the special request for one, if you're willing to read us one more. And the
Okay,
poem is Musing on Lilith Lost to Time.
let's do it.
Yes.
Musing on Lilith Lost to Time. All four women doing whatever they feel like. Musing on Lilith Lost to Time. The myth is Granddaddy's mother birthed 12 children by 12 discreet men. I asked what she did for work, and my big brother, of a different father, laughed at my insinuation that sex could be her job, as if being a whore is a joke, a lark, as if she, a ground-dwelling songbird with her streaky brown plumage, didn't shift her bones to shape the world 12 times. It was America after all. It was 1930 to 1953. It was Beaufort, South Carolina, and a woman is her own business. What's so funny? How many times did she make the shape of the sky with her legs, the oblong sphere of the earth with her belly? How many times was she an ossuary? Lilith, with her crooked feet, maybe could only deliver her song in flight, crest pressed forward by her back's arc. belly swollen from fucking in that good, sweet way women do when they want to.
I just wanted to ask a very general, like, question, and of course, everything is in the poem, but I wanted you to speak about the process of writing this poem in particular, how it came to you, and what it was the experience of writing it.
How did it come to be? So I was in graduate school doing lots of research on um, genealogy and family, and I came across an archive of photos. I was in this practice of writing ekphrasis poems, uh, but I also simultaneously had been studying my maternal line, um, and was I think in like an internet argument with somebody during Trump's reelection or Trump's first election about whether sex work is work. Of course, it
Mhm.
is the oldest work, and it is also maybe secondary to just pleasure, which is like sex is free, and if it's pleasurable and it's the 1950s and you got time, maybe that's what you want to do. Um, so all of those ideas came together in this poem for me, but also I was thinking about Lilith, this woman who was basically, outcast, but is also upheld as an idol. Um, it made me think about all of the women who get forgotten, get lost, who get their stories mangled because they're not told by themselves.
Written out.
Hmm. Not written down, and then the sort of popular gossip, the oral storytelling about them is condemning, as though what they do isn't miraculous. And so, yeah, this was my response to that. It was also an effort to connect this Black woman's beauty to the everyday beauty of a songbird that's also forgotten or ignored. Yeah.
So we read your bio, of course, at the beginning, and because I always suspect that there are other young poets or poets who were just starting their journey with the craft, who are curious about the nitty gritty of how you live as a poet or work as a poet and have a career as a poet in the day to day. A
Mm.
question that I repeat often is asking poets and artists alike, well, poets are artists, but poets, visual artists, philosophers, thinkers alike, to speak to a career path or what that looks like. Because I think that sometimes we fall into the belief when we're young poets, meaning that we're just starting our journey with it, that it has to look a certain way. There are certain things that have to be achieved or certain people that you have to know. And it can the expectation can kind of mangle one's experience from the beginning and make the work seem like suffering, and it is sometimes, rather than the variation that it really is. It follows the variations of the day-to-day feeling.
Mm.
So I wanted you to speak a little bit about your path as a poet and how you came to make craft like your part of your career,
Sure. Um,
or what
Poetry,
it takes in the everyday sense.
yeah, poetry is a practice. Creativity is a gift, but it's also something that every human has access to, and it maybe exists outside of us. And we can be conduit to it, but only if we show up to be a conduit to it, to be some receptacle. And that means having routines that allow for whatever kind of creativity you're trying to do to show up. So if you're into interior decorating, you gotta be near the inside of some place and move the furniture around. You know, if you are into writing poems, then you should read a lot of poems and show up to wherever it is you feel comfortable writing them. If you're typing them on your notes app or if you're at a desk at somebody else's home in a sublet in Queens, like I am, you show up at that desk at the same time every week and try to make a poem. Um, I like to set a timer because otherwise I'll start thinking about other things and I'll pretend I'm writing a poem by like reading about octopodes for 4 hours or something. Um, so that's the primary thing. If you're into having a creative life, make sure that you protect your creative time and then show up ready to be present. Uh, I think it's a real effort every day to maintain beginner brain, just to show up and like, try to be aware of what's going on around you, which requires a little bit of sitting down inside yourself and, being still internally, even if you're out here in the streets moving around.
Mhm.
Um, but, we need money and there's no one path toward an art life. And because of that, it is hard. It's harder to make up a path than to follow one that's already trod. Um, so those are just facts. If you are interested in being an academic, then there's a pretty straightforward path. you know. If you're interested in being a creative academic, then the first thing you have to do is publish a couple of books, and that's a hard thing to do.
Mm.
So if you are maintaining and making and maintaining your space to be receptive to your creative life, then hopefully you're doing that with other people at some sort of like salon or a house gathering around a table where you talk about books and you write poems with your friends because that's what I did in Chicago and in Houston. I would go over to the Real Talk House when it existed and write with the kind of nerds that like to hang out on a Sunday afternoon and write poems. Or I'd go to the reading workshop series, Box Ferris After Dark, that was hosted by my friend Marty for 10 years. Or I'd go to the Uptown Poetry Slam at the Green Mill uh, every Sunday and read poems with people because being with the people who care about the art that you do, the kind of craft that you're into, will inspire you to make more of it, if not for competition or for like trying to woo someone, just because being around the thing leads to more of that thing happening. So that's what I would encourage you to do is like go be with the people who are in love with the thing you're in love with so that you can share it with one another and it doesn't get mangled by some rigid hierarchy that's been attached to the practice. Uh, yeah, and my friend drives a bus every day. He writes poems and publishes books of poems. That's a life. And he I guess has a poetry career wherein he works with a friend who manages a small press, but he hasn't decided that his money needs to come from poems, and so his poems are free in a kind of way. Um, and his poem Making Life is free from that kind of constraint. Not everything you do has to be monetized.
Mhm.
I set about to be a professor when I was 16. It took a 10-year roundabout path away from that. And then spent the last 10 years making my way back to it. And now that's what I do. And it means that there are a couple months built in every year where my job is to read and write poems. And to write about writing poems and to talk to other people about it. And it's really lovely. But also, it means that I am a teacher, and that's a separate skill and it's a separate craft. And if you're into doing both simultaneously, great. If you also want to be an editor on top of it because you, for some reason, do not want to do anything with your free time but read and write, then, you know, take on the sort of editor path, which starts with freelancing on like your friend's novel that they just made or uh, editing a newsletter for a church or something and then applying to assistant editor roles. There's lots of ways to do it and make money, but some people are just happy like making books and being bartenders. Do what makes you happy because suffering is not pretty and it is not romantic.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Um, You've already talked about landscape and using landscape as a kind of guide for your craft practice in your second book that you mentioned. But thinking about your field of vision in this book, it made me think of the glances and gazes that are exchanged in conversation,
Yeah,
looking at who you're talking to with purpose when you're speaking to them.
yeah,
And I wanted to ask you about that field of vision because that's part of what I sensed is like you're sitting very closely with 3 or 4 people who are extremely important to you, and you're making that eye contact that's very intentional and deep and serious and healing and also questioning, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's the field of vision that I had because I mentioned I could see my family, right?
Mm.
Like I was exchanging important gazes while I was reading through it, but I wanted you to talk about your field of vision here and all the blood involved in love.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for seeing this book, seeing me in it, seeing us. Um, yeah, I don't know. It is in lots of ways. This is a very typical debut collection. It is a close look at family. It's a close look at the family of origin and the chosen family and the imagined potential made family. And it is all about looking closely at these people that created me, um, with fear and admiration and desire and uh, gratitude. And it is the project of this book is not to beautify or to focus on casting only a flattering light, but to shed light on the darkest parts to make sure nothing's hidden. And that's a pretty intense undertaking and an uncomfortable one, but it is also like the big water invested in a, a sober look and a real look at what's actually going on so that the love affairs in here can proceed with everyone knowing everyone else. And that's what we get when we look into someone's eyes for an extended period of time and find ourselves falling in love or falling into darkness or falling into curiosity or falling, um, certainly falling. So, yeah, I think that's a really accurate rendering of the field of vision here. It is a very close look, um, but that range doesn't allow for a broad enough, or for doesn't include the broader scope. And so I think that's actually the next project is to take a step back.
Are you willing to share a little bit more? Because that's the last question. We have 2 minutes and I have 2 questions. I mean, I've asked questions that I'm not prepared because I have all these, you talk and I want to know more. Um, so the last question is what's the new pearl that's gathering inside of you? And you've mentioned this book. And if you are not willing to say more, I have another question. If you're protective, which is understandable, but if you're willing, then what is it
Oh yeah.
so
Well,
far?
I'm not sure what it's going to. I mean, right now I have like 100 pages of poems I've written over the last couple of years. Uh, they do not make a book, but they will. Um, yeah, they're largely about bounty, about what quiet time outside provides in the midst of um, aging and cancer and yeah, it's about bounty, what we get from showing up in our bodies and showing up on the earth.
What's the greatest lesson you've learned from poetry, Maya? What's the hardest or the greatest thing the craft has taught you?
Take your time. It takes time, and the time is outside of you. So, and both of those things are true.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your generosity, your ideas, and your clarity, and also your vulnerability and speaking to both sides. I think some of these conversations tend to be positivized, right? But as always, when we meet, your frankness and your clarity and your straightforwardness are always a gift. And
Thank
I'm so happy that I got to spend this time with you.
you.
And everybody, if you're signed on late or if you're just now signing on to Facebook and it's over, it's going to be on Facebook. So we'll see you over there. And thank you, Maya.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
We're
Ari.
ready. Bye. We're ready, Ari. Have a good night, everyone. Make sure you send me your W-9. We're not live anymore, but we're still recording. But make sure you send me your W-9 and your invoice.
Oh, I will. I'll do both of those things. I'm gonna